Welcome to our Carnegie Council Book Talk. Thanks for joining us. Our guest today is Robert Kaplan. Bob's the author of a new book, The Good American, The Epic Life of Bob Gersony, the US government's greatest humanitarian. I can't think of a person or a book that better embodies and exemplifies the mission of the Carnegie Council than Bob Kaplan and this book. So Bob, thanks so much for zooming in to join us today.
It's my pleasure, Joel.
Bob, most of you will know Bob for his many books and articles on history, geography, and culture. Bob has traveled to and reported from the most remote places on the map. His writing reflects on the human experience from poverty-stricken and war-torn countries to the most incredible landscapes of the natural world. Bob's deservedly well known for his political analysis, but for me, I'm always most moved by his human-centered approach, what it means to live in specific times and in particular places. In this book, Bob has found a way to tell at least three stories. The story of Bob Gersony, a great humanitarian, the story of an essential moral dimension of US foreign policy during the Cold War and after, and his own story, the story of one analyst at a moment in time trying to make sense of the often brutal consequences of power politics and the human impulse to respond in a moral way. This book is a real gift, showing us the broad sweep of history and the impact of a great, if not well-known man. Now, Bob's going to kick things off with an introduction to the book, and after that, we'll have some conversation and Q&A. Please use the chat function to submit your questions, and we'll take up those at the back end of the hour. Bob, over to you.
Well, thank you, Joel. Thanks so much for the invitation to once again speak at Carnegie Ethics Council, as I've been doing, I think, for about 26 or 27 years. This book it's a story about an epic biography of the greatest humanitarian you've never heard of. And that's the whole point, because he's only known before this book to an inside culture of State Department and United States Agency for International Development workers, essentially, and to some people in the CIA, the National Security Council. People inside Washington know all about him, but to a larger group, even to the human rights community in New York, they've probably never heard of him, or if they have, it's just been very incidental, and for one thing or another. It was a story too good to refuse to tell, essentially. And I, in fact, interrupted another book in order to break away and spend 3 years on this. Imagine someone from a wealthy Jewish family in Manhattan of Holocaust refugees. His father did very well in business in the commodity trade, who nevertheless not only did not go to college, but did not graduate high school because he had a very mild reading learning disability that has since been cured, essentially, but which made it impossible for him to study in the usual way. And so what did he do? He went into the commodity trade like his father, which becomes very crucial later on during his humanitarian work, and then joins the army, volunteers to go to Vietnam, and is awarded a Bronze Star for service in Vietnam. Think of this. It's a kid from Manhattan, drops out of high school, wins a Bronze Star in Vietnam. And then after that, to make a long story short, he got his start doing refugee work during the Great Guatemalan earthquake of the mid-late 1970s, was discovered by USAID. And even though he didn't even have a high school education, he began a career that would last over 40 years, working for the State Department and US AID in one conflict and disaster zone in the developing world after another. You know, we talk about storied great foreign correspondents who may have covered most wars and who may have interviewed dozens upon dozens in each place. Here's the story who is someone who is not specifically a reporter, but basically that's what he did, who is in literally everywhere, every foreign war and disaster area, and interviewed not dozens, but hundreds in each place, and brought back his analytical reports to USAID, to the State Department, and consequently made foreign policy a bit smarter and a bit more humane, sometimes dramatically so. A few examples of the kinds of things he accomplished. In 1984, he discovered a mass murder in central Uganda in a region called the Luwero Triangle. And he brought the news back to Washington. And the result was that it led to the collapse of the murderous regime of Milton Obote, who succeeded Idi Amin, and it brought to power someone who at the time, 35 years ago, was a beacon of light, Yoweri Museveni, who was educated, who had a disciplined army, did not loot when they took over towns, and also improved the standing of the United States in East Africa. It would become a theme of Gersony. If you do the right thing in a humanitarian sense, you improve the American strategic and geopolitical position. In Mozambique, a few years later, Southern Africa during the, in the late 80s, was a maelstrom of war. There was massive, epic cinematic war in Angola, in Mozambique. The Portuguese Empire had collapsed, and both East and West forces were fighting over the carcass of the empire. And the Reagan administration was all ready to anoint the Renamo guerrillas in Mozambique as recipients of military aid under the Reagan doctrine. Gersony shows up in his typical fashion, interviews hundreds of refugees all along the 1,500-mile border of Mozambique, from South Africa in the south to near Tanzania in the north, and then all through Mozambique in the heart of the country, and comes back and said, Renamo are a bunch of murderers and rapists. They have no political plan whatsoever. Even though we're supporting another anti-communist guerrilla group in Angola, Renamo in Mozambique is nothing like the group we're supporting in Angola. Result, Gersony comes home, briefs George Shultz in his office with Maureen Reagan. Very common for Gersony to come back from sleeping in a sleeping bag in the field for weeks and weeks and briefing high policymakers. Shultz goes to Reagan. Renamo is cut out of the Reagan doctrine. And the result of that is that the Mozambique Civil War starts to wind down, saving hundreds of thousands of lives as a result of one man going around just asking peasants and refugees what happened to them, and putting it through his commodity trader / accountant / math mind analytical filter. Bob Gersony was not enraptured by causes. He was not a liberal arts major. He was very much a math mind with an interest in commodity prices of agriculture, goods that peasants, the lifeblood of peasants who he spent his life in the developing world. And then there was Rwanda, where a genocide of 850,000 people had just occurred. There was a new government in power, and Gersony goes up and down Rwanda, across the whole country, interviewing hundreds, comes back and said, guess what? The new government has now mass murdered 30,000. It's not a genocide like 850,000, but it's a mass murder. This complicated policy to no end, because the UN, the US were four square behind supporting the new regime. The result was the US and the UN brought pressure to bear on the new regime. The killing stopped, mainly because of one man and what he did. Bob Gersony solved the problem of Vietnamese boat people. who were being besieged on the high seas by Thai pirates. He engineered an intelligence operation on the docks where the pirates congregated to talk about their exploits in dockside bars. And through this intelligence operation, the problem was solved within 3 years. Bob Gersony was the first person to discover face-to-face and report out of the Lord's Resistance Armies, the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda, and the human rights depredations they were recording. It would only be 13 years after he filed a massive report on it that the social media would pay attention. You know, he was that far ahead of the curve. And I'll give you just one final example of the many examples in the book, is that we were spending billions of dollars on Plan Colombia to eradicate coca production in the farm fields from which cocaine is made. But despite spending billions, we had no idea if we were successful. Bob Gersony goes into the most dangerous parts of southern Colombia, in the parts occupied by guerrilla forces who are producing cocaine, and with his fluent Spanish walks into the fields and asks farmers face to face, "Hey, you still growing coca in those fields?" And that's how he found out what billions of dollars could not do. Bob Gersony is he's a neurotic character, a neurotic Jewish character right out of a Saul Bellow novel. If you've read Saul Bellow novels, you know all about Bob Gersony. But he spent his life in settings best described by Joseph Conrad. So there's an element of Saul Bellow, an element of dangerous tropical gloomy settings of Joseph Conrad. Bob Gersony exposed the illusion of knowledge where none actually existed. You know, in this age of internet, of social media, of the digital video world, we have this assumption that we know what's going on in Myanmar, not just in the capital city, but in the countryside. We have an assumption that we know what's going on in Ethiopia and all these places, but you don't really know unless someone goes there and asks questions and finds out, because it's only by being alone on the ground that all the nuances and subtleties of a place come at you, that you could bring back to high policymakers in Washington, you know, to warn them about things ahead. You know, when I interviewed over 100 people about Bob Gersony's career, they all said he always found the truth, no matter how inconvenient it was. A truth that often nobody wanted here in Washington, but which they acted upon because he always had a way to show how human rights belonged in the hierarchy of needs of a superpower. The United States is still a great power. It has interests. Many of those interests are not immoral, they're amoral. They have to do with, controlling sea lanes, supporting one regime over another, and on it goes. Bob Gersony showed he was able to speak to policymakers one-on-one and explain to them why a human rights policy would help America's geopolitical position. And that was the real genius of him. He could relate. He understood national interest very much. He was a Vietnam veteran and proud of it. He was basically, and this will also sound weird, among all the other weird things I've said about him, is he was basically a conservative pessimist, not an ideological conservative, just sort of a bit right of center, a pessimist who always thought of what could go wrong. And because he always thought of what could go wrong, the worst things didn't happen, because he warned policymakers in advance that if you don't do something about this, this will happen. That, he was like a genius at anxious foresight, which is a term that comes out of Machiavelli, really. The best policy emerges from early warning. Bob Gersony was like a human rights early warning system. He was one person who made a difference. and who really showed what can be done with the American brand. And he operated at a time, the Cold War, the late Cold War, and the immediate post-Cold War, when the State Department really worked, when you had neoconservatives working hand in hand with realists, when the policy battles that would come after the end of the Cold War, and particularly after 9/11 and after the invasion of Iraq, were very muted. So that it was a much less ideological State Department. You had people right of center, left of center, but the center ruled, in other words. And Bob Gersony, during the high point of his career, had the luck to work with George Shultz, who just passed away the other day at age 100. George Shultz, in his very person, inculcated national interest and human rights. He was a Cold War hardliner, but he supported Gersony's work in Mozambique, in Ethiopia and Sudan, all over. He was very receptive to Gersony's arguments about human rights, not only in Africa, but in Central America and in elsewhere. So George Shultz is like a minor distant character in this story. And you see a side of George Shultz that you may not get elsewhere, despite all that's been written about him over the last 48 hours. And finally, I'll just say this is a book about history from the ground up. It's about the middle levels of the State Department, the assistant secretaries, the deputy assistant secretaries, diplomacy at the ground level. We just had recently a great book, a great biography written about James Baker III. And that's about high policy from the top. Look at this book as like a complement to that, to what was going on at the bottom levels among people you never heard of, but accomplished great things in their very anonymous way.
Bob, that was great. Thank you for that introduction. I have a couple of questions just to follow up and just to kind of tee up the conversation. And I wanted to start by just talking about the book itself, and then we'll get to Gersony. But for me, the title of it was very telling, and it had echoes. So the title is The Good American. And as I think of it, I was thinking of the echoes of The Ugly American, Lederer and Burdick, and then also The Quiet American, Graham Greene. And just to give you my interpretation, the ugly American is about arrogance.
Yeah.
The arrogance of power. The quiet American was about the sort of innocence, in a way, of America. And I just wanted to prompt you to say a little bit more. You've already said a bit, but maybe a little bit more about when you say good.
Yeah.
And you're putting it in a realist perspective. And the way my interpretation, what you meant by good was some things about awareness, the limits of power.
Yeah.
There was sort of a self-knowledge, in a way, combined with pragmatism and empiricism, these sort of American qualities of, sort of problem solving. But anyway, he sort of seemed to sort of capture that. There was a sort of can-do, but also a sense of what the limits were. Maybe you could just say a little bit more about that. How?
Sure, Joel. Yes, it was a very conscious decision that, to make the title The Good American, not great, because as I say at the end of the book, greatness involves a high degree of ambition. And Gersony was never ambitious except to get the truth out of each assignment. He would never wanted to be an assistant secretary of state or anything like that. He just wanted to be out in the field, like the best foreign correspondents are people who never want to come back to be foreign editor of the paper. They just want to, die out in the field, essentially. So Gersony was the good American in the sense that there's very rarely a great poem. There's a good poem. Philip Larkin wrote good poems, you see. Robert Conquest wrote good poems. And Gersony is a good man who is against the arrogance of America. In fact, I'll give you an example. His whole methodology of interviewing people was a weapon against arrogance, because he always assumed that each peasant he spoke to was an expert at what they knew. They were an expert at what they had experienced, and he had to find out their experience. So he had to tap into their expertise. So he always treated them with great dignity and respect, telling them, I need to learn from you, essentially. You don't need to learn anything from me. And therefore, he was able to draw out for hours upon hours in each interview by flipping the whole thing of who had power. In that conversation. So he was against arrogance, and he was against innocence too, because, as I said, he was a conservative pessimist. He started in Vietnam, and in Vietnam he fell in love with the books of the European American journalist and historian Bernard Fall. And Bernard Fall predicted in his books that the Americans would fail in Vietnam, just as the French had failed because of arrogance, because they didn't take the time to learn the cultural nuances of the situation, of who exactly they were dealing with. So that Bob Gersony, made it his life work to replicate Bernard Fall, essentially. So he was against arrogance, against innocence, and that's why he was the good American as opposed to a great American.
Yeah. Hey, Bob, let's talk a little bit about his, following on that, his independence as well. So he didn't work for the State Department.
Officially, no.
He was an independent. So can you talk a little bit about the sort of pluses and minuses of sort of in the system, but not really in the system?
He spent over 40 years as a private contractor for the U.S. Agency for International Development and the State Department, and occasionally for the United Nations or for a relief charity that would hire him. So essentially, he was a freelancer who had to be rehired for over 40 years in succession, over and over again, even though he always ruffled feathers, didn't make people angry at him, but made them very inconvenienced, because he would come back with the kind of inconvenient information that would lead them to force people to rethink policy. But because he was essentially not a staffer, not even a foreign service officer, officially speaking, he was not part of any group think. He was not part of any mindset. He was not part of any bureaucratic personality or mindset. And this allowed him to come back with counterintuitive truths all the time. And it also made him more vulnerable. And he felt this vulnerability. So he had to be that much more, he needed that much more energy to make sure that the new assignment would not be his last. He suffered bouts of anxiety throughout his life that required medication, all because he felt insecure, and it was his insecurity that drove each assignment.
So I was going to then turn it to you, because in some ways, you're an independent operator. You've lived a life very similar in a way to Bob Gersony, and I know that's probably part of the attraction for you to write about him. But could you just reflect a little bit in terms of your own experience in sort of independently operating and reporting, and just sort of how this all sort of falls on you in terms of Gersony's story?
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Joel. Gersony and I have led parallel lives. We met each other in Khartoum, Sudan, in a cheap hotel 35 years ago, during what was then a front page news story. It was the great Ethiopian famine of the mid-1980s. And the listening post was Khartoum in Sudan, because that's where the refugees poured out of Ethiopia into eastern Sudan. And Gersony I liked him immediately. He wasn't like the other journalists or aid workers. He was not voluble. He was not a conversationalist. He was a bit awkward, a bit quiet, different. And over the decades, we constantly crossed paths with each other. And he was like me, he was a freelancer, essentially, a freelancer of the spirit, if not technically always a freelancer. There have been periods in my career where I've had, W-2 forms, staff jobs, built up pension points, that kind of stuff. But essentially, I was a freelancer in the same way Gersony was. We often came back with unpopular truths in that sense. And we always had to produce, because if we didn't produce on each assignment, there may not be another one. So I felt very close to him. He was also like me, a bit conservative, a bit a bit of a pessimist, which caused a mutual attraction. And so we were like brothers of the spirit, in a sense. And also he was very analytical. He spent his life with liberal human rights types, liberal arts human rights types in the developing world. He had a friend, Tony Jackson, who's a character in the book, who Gersony always joked, Tony, you're my ambassador to the left, because come with me on this assignment. You know how to talk to these people. And Tony Jackson was a Brit. He speaks fluent French, several languages, very outgoing, idealistic, the opposite of Bob, but they were great friends. And yet the same thing with myself. I've always been like an analytical, geopolitical sort, spending significant portions of my career, and in fact overseas assignments with people who are a bit opposite, who are more liberal, less analytical, more involved in telling human interest narratives, so to speak. In other words, I was interested in big forces, and a lot of journalists are interested in telling the personal story. And in this book, I flip it, of course, because I tell a personal story, but there's a geopolitical angle in almost every chapter of this book, in order to set the stage for what Gersony has done.
Well, it's interesting because I was thinking about your work and Gersony's work, and there's a part in this book and you say it repeatedly about how Gersony worked with facts, not ideology. And you're sort of interested in both, but this is what you said about Gersony. You said how his life is about how granularity of distant places defeats all theories.
Yes,
right?
It defeats all isms, whether it's neoconservatism, conservatism, realism, or idealism, because Gersony believed in the uniqueness of each place. There was one USAID personnel. She was the director of USAID in Quito, Ecuador. This is about 20 years ago. Her name was Hilda Bambi Arellano. And she hired Gersony to look at the border between Ecuador and Colombia and to see what was going on. And she said to me, what I liked about him immediately is he didn't say something like, well, northern Ecuador, it's like this place in Asia or this place in Africa. He respected the uniqueness of each place. And then when he spent weeks traveling through northern Ecuador, he said, well, the east part of northern Ecuador is very different from the central part, and we'll need different solutions for each part. It was that kind of granularity where, because I've discovered as a foreign correspondent, sometimes the most unpleasant things you can do in Washington is to tell people what you actually saw and experienced, because it flies in the face of their grand theories about the world, so to speak. And that's another thing that attracted me to Gersony. He's not a big think person. He's a very granular person, like what's going on here on the ground and what specifically can we do, if anything, to alleviate it.
So So where do you think we are now? I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about the hollowing out of the State Department and, the sort of devaluing of all this expertise and so on. What's your sense? I mean, do you think that as we sit here today, our country, United States, has learned a lesson of the need for this kind of ground truth, informant driven facts, or where are we? Can we build that capacity into the system, or do we have the means to find the next Bob Gersony or people like him?
Well, we're at a time when the larger forces are working against the next Bob Gersonys. There's a famous line in Ernest Hemingway's first book, The Sun Also Rises, where there's a character who's gone bankrupt and is just an alcoholic because he's gone bankrupt. And another character asks him, how do you go bankrupt? How does it happen? And he said, well, first gradually and then suddenly, So that's kind of like the State Department and USAID, because the drift downward actually began at the end of the Cold War. Once the whole U.S. foreign affairs bureaucracy lost a good deal of its focus because it didn't have one enemy to focus on, one ideological system to oppose. So already there was this gradual diminution of the importance of state, of USAID, of CIA, of all of this. The 90s were an era where we felt that we were the unipolar power, nobody could challenge us. It made us sloppy and a bit lazy. But it all went sudden with the Trump era. It was like the Trump era was a real decimation of the State Department and USAID. But it's important to realize that it actually started sooner in a more gradual way. Also, social media is a disruptive technology. It gives people the assumption that we don't need people out in the field. You can know anything by the internet or by following the Twitter feed from this country or that. Also, email itself has made it harder for diplomats at American embassies in foreign capitals to escape from the embassy and take a bus or travel around the country and file a cable about what they've seen, because email changed them to their desk, because they're getting emails not only from their immediate superiors at state, but from commerce, agriculture, all these departments who now, because it's so easy to get in touch with a first secretary or a second secretary, just bombard them with questions. And so, it's a matter of getting back to the basics in many ways. It's state and USAID, and the basics are about cable writing. It's now obviously you do it on a computer, you file it, but it's historically called cable writing. It's like what the great print and typewriter newspapers of the day used to do so wonderfully. And it was best expressed on what used to be page 3 of the New York Times, A3, where you didn't get the front page story, but you got like a 1,400 word story by one of their best correspondents about what's going on in Thailand or what's going on in the African Republic or something like that. And it was fascinating, even though it was not a page 1 item. And, and that's when we really learned about the world. And it's a matter of spiritually getting back to that. Discovering the importance of old-fashioned reporting, whether it's state, CIA, USAID, or whatever.
With that in mind, what do you think about the future of humanitarianism generally as part of U.S. foreign policy? In the book, you talk about how during the Cold War era, there was a certain logic to it, that strategy and altruism sort of went together in service of sort of anti-communism. Then you talk a little bit about how that fades after the Cold War. Where's your sense of where we are now in terms of U.S. foreign policy and
Yes,
humanitarian?
yeah. The Cold War made humanitarianism both harder and easier than it is now. It made it harder because we would put up with great atrocities if the country in question was anti-communist or anti-Soviet. That's where it made it harder. It made it easier in the sense that we cared about every country on the map. Because we were in a battle for influence with the Soviet Union. And influence meant having humanitarian aid programs, foreign aid. Now it's different. Now it's different. But the crucial thing that has happened is that the world has become smaller because of digital communications. We're already more and more of a human community. A nervous, anxious, claustrophobic world out there. And because we're united by global media, reputational issues like a country's respect for human rights achieve more importance. So while it's important to kind of compete with China and Russia in the military sphere and other spheres, it's also important for us to promote humanitarianism because that gives us a leg up against these two autocratic powers. If we don't have humanitarianism baked into our foreign policy, then we're just following a one-dimensional realpolitik like Russia and China are.
And do you think, I'm just curious, do you have some sense of optimism in the sense? I know you're a realist and perhaps a pessimist by disposition, but what you're describing requires some degree of humility, but also resolve. And do you see elements of that in terms of, as we think about the sort of next, post-Trump, and we're trying. There's a sort of a idea of a new internationalism of some way of this.
Well, I think various things, Joel, on this.
Yeah.
First of all, the Biden administration will be a vast improvement over the Trump administration in this matter, no matter what happens. But keep in mind that the Biden administration is not dealing with the America of the Cold War or even the post-Cold War, when the United States had a vast, dynamic, and united and very robust middle class, which underwrote big foreign aid programs, a big Navy, and everything like that. So it acquiesced to whatever our ambition was in the wider world. And the America of today has a battered middle class that's divided up between a cosmopolitan upper middle centered around the two coasts and university towns, and a lower middle drifting towards poverty, which is alienated by any internationalist form of foreign policy. So it's a less united country than it was. And so it will be harder for the Biden administration to serve up anything beyond rhetoric. America is not what it was. It cannot bring back civilian government in Myanmar by snapping its fingers, or things such as that. So, but I still think because it's a smaller, more claustrophobic world where human rights violations get immediate attention in the news through social media and other things, that it will drive us to this, what I call, inserting human rights high up in the hierarchy of needs of a U.S. foreign policy.
Interesting. Great. We have, Bob, we have a few questions that have come in. So this is going to kind of go back now, drill down a little bit to some of your, but it's good because it'll give a sense of the book and the really very rich examples that you have. So I'm going to just read one here. This one's about Iraq. And then I want to come to one about the Balkans later.
Okay,
but the first one is, this is from Charles Flynn. I realize that you could not detail every assignment, and others have written volumes about Iraq, but I'm wondering what truth-telling Gersony did about Iraqi reconstruction.
Yes, there's a whole chapter on Iraqi reconstruction in the book. It's not a big chapter, it's a small one. Basically, after the invasion of Iraq, and the invasion of Iraq, the post-invasion time of the Iraq War was a failure on many levels. This book goes into the failure on the USAID level, which doesn't get much attention in many of the books written about Iraq, but it does in this book. And Gersony is sent out to Baghdad to find out why US aid failed in its mission to immediately be on the ground, up and running with aid programs in the aftermath of the invasion. And he interviews in his typical style, hundreds of people, comes back, and then is sent back again to come up with ways in which it could be improved. So makes a second trip to Iraq. And he comes back saying it failed because the chain of command wasn't there. Quite honestly, the aid community was not completely on board with the military authorities because they weren't used to taking orders from generals and colonels. The aid community thought of like international operations as humanitarian operations, like in the 1990s in the Balkans. But Iraq was different. It was a military occupation, no matter how you parsed it. So Iraq is dealt with in the book, and one of the conclusions that Gersony came up with, and which I share with the reader, is that like Vietnam, where he discovered Bernard Fall, Iraq was wrong from the beginning. But having been wrong from the beginning, nevertheless, it could have turned out much better than it did had the right programs and the right people been in charge on the ground. In other words, Iraq was a disaster, but it could have been much less of a disaster, to the point where we'd actually be arguing about whether it was worth doing or not. And Gersony came back with all these recommendations, which were in fact implemented, but it was too little too late. Remember, at the end of the day, he was just one man against vast impersonal forces.
Great, that's good. To go to another example, one I was very much taken with was the description of his interventions in the Balkans after the war, and basically in terms of the resettlement issues in the late 1990s. And the issue there was what was possible in terms of bringing people back to their homes.
Right.
And this was, anyway, maybe you could say a little bit about Gersony's perception of, the peace agreement, what it called for, but also what was possible on the ground as he was interviewing the actual.
One of the aims about this book was to show you regions, not only obscure regions that you knew very little about in the first place, but regions that got a lot of news attention, like Rwanda, like the Balkans, but show them in a different way than any of the newspapers did. In the Balkans was like Rwanda. Gersony went in after the fact, not before the fact. He went in just as the Dayton Peace Accords, negotiated by the late American diplomat Richard Holbrooke, had been initialed and were about to be implemented. This was fall 1995. And Gersony goes to Bosnia, goes to Croatia to Bosnia, and then would spend 3 months going up and down Bosnia, interviewing not only refugees and displaced persons, but aid workers who had been on the ground in war-torn Bosnia for 4 years already. Because remember, the Bosnian War started in force in about 1992, and Gersony doesn't get there till late 1995. So the aid workers he's dealing with are people who stayed the course, and what he called the RAND Corporation of Humanitarian Aid for Bosnia, that's the kind of expertise he was getting, And what he discovered was the Dayton Accords were, they stopped the war, but the situation was so fragile, it would not take much to restart the war and make Dayton seem to have been a failure. So it was a fragile situation, number one. And some of what Dayton recommended was impossible to implement at the moment. Specifically, Dayton wanted minority return, which is a fancy Washington word for instance, if you have a city, a village of 300 Croats, and there were 4 Muslim families, those 4 Muslim families had to go home with the 300 Croats and be accepted by them, have their school-age children accepted by them, and have nothing bad happen to them, get their home back, because that's what Dayton intended to do, was to rip up this whole legacy of interethnic war in the region. And Gersony, after interviewing hundreds, including very human rights workers on the ground with a lot of experience, said that minority return has to be postponed. That you're just not going to be able to protect 24/7 a minority family literally right after a 4-year-old interethnic war that killed people in the most horrific way, and in which the embers of dislike and distrust were still so high. So Gersony argued for majority return. In other words, said most of the people in refugee camps are majorities in their villages. Get them out of these refugee camps, get them resettled in their houses, build up community centers, get the electricity started again, repair the roofs. In other words, give Dayton some foundation so it doesn't slip back into war and render Dayton a failure. And once you do that, you could think about minority returns. In other words, his philosophy, and not just in Bosnia, but elsewhere, was don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And the good thing to do is to get the majority back in place, to close down some of these refugee camps. And eventually that's what happened. They built, I think it was 2,500 and some odd homes for majority returnees. And that led other aid agencies to kind of piggyback on USAID and provide, electricity, community centers, all of that, schools, that kind of thing. And that played a role, I don't want to exaggerate it, it played a role in keeping former Yugoslavia peaceful, so that it did not slip back into war. And Dayton, therefore, remained a great limited success. Limited in the sense that it stopped the war in its track, and it didn't continue on, even if now, 25 years later or so, interethnic relations in the former Yugoslavia are often not good.
Thank you for sharing that, the details there of that particular example. What I wanted the viewers and the listeners to get from this conversation is a sense of both the sweep, the geographic sweep of the epic life, really is an epic life of Bob Gersony in terms of the places he visited, but then the level of detail that he got into. We go everywhere from Micronesia to the former Yugoslavia. It's incredible. But my question, Bob, is this is a age-old question about generalists versus those with particular expertise in a language or an area. And as a generalist myself, and I think you're a generalist, could you just give us some reflections on that in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of moving around from place to place, as Bob did and as you have?
Yes, Bob Gersony was both a generalist and an area specialist, because his specialty was Central America, essentially. Mm-hmm. He spent more years on the ground in war-torn Central America than elsewhere, and he was a fluent Spanish speaker. So he was a specialist, but in a larger sense, he was a generalist. He had to parachute into places and not spend a week there, but spend 4 months there interviewing hundreds of people. And I should say each of these interviews often lasted several hours. A generalist is a quick study. has an analytical side, can focus in on the most salient facts and relate to U.S. interest or to the interest of whatever country he or she is representing. An area specialist, spends his or her whole life about dealing with one country or one linguistic region or something, and sees all the nuances that a generalist often fails to make. But when it comes to policymakers don't have time to listen to 6-hour briefings, about all the nuances. They need someone who they can trust analytically, who could give them a bottom line. I've been a generalist because I've written books on various parts of the world, but in the course of writing a book, I've had to delve into area specialty and interview a lot of area specialists. So, the best kind of generalists have a feel for granularity, in each place. Bob Gersony was a great generalist because when he started reading books about each place before he went there, he would read books by area specialists, by journalists, by travel writers, by academics who had spent their whole life covering one country or one region. So, he tapped into area specialty. And so that's what the best type of generalist does. The worst kind is someone, and I'm I'm generalizing about generalists, is someone in a big imperial capital who believes we should spread democracy or just do this because America's own, historical experience, for instance, with democracy, supersedes that country 6,000 miles away, that country's own historical experience. Gersony was always sensitive to other people's historical experiences.
That's great. We're coming towards the end, just a couple more questions. Just getting back to Gersony himself, and we'll sort of end with this. But I'm trying to get a sense of, the thread that runs through the book. And I guess my sense is, did he feel that his client was always the United States of America, the government of the United States, or do you think he had, because he was so practical, right? He was almost like a consultant in a way.
Right, yeah.
And he sort of, as you said, he was a great souled person, but he had the sort of approach of an accountant, right? So he sort of, but I just want to make sure I understood correctly that the client was the United States government, and in terms of what the government's capacity could be to deliver some humanitarian outcome.
Yeah. Remember, when the case of Rwanda, he had two clients. He had USAID and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. In other words, USAID hired him for Rwanda, but then loaned him to UNHCR to actually carry out his investigation. And yes, he served the United States of America. He was very much a nation state American in that sense. And he came back with facts, and he believed that truth and facts could liberate, essentially. That there was such a thing as truth. It's not just a world of competing narratives where you have your narrative and I have mine, and we have to tell each other our narratives. That was not Gersony. Gersony believed there's a real truth here. Good and bad may be complex, or they may not be. There may be good guys and bad guys. It may be more complicated than that, but it was a truth, And so he was loyal to the truth, and he brought back the truth to what was, for most of his career, the most powerful country in the world.
So just to wrap up, Bob, so tell us about Bob Gersony now. Can you he's in retirement. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about him and your relationship and how the book sort of came to be in that sense.
Yes, certainly. Yeah. Bob Gersony now he's 76 months, in fact, I believe. And he lives in Great Falls, Virginia. And he married late because of all his traveling that he did. And it was the plan of him and his wife to have perhaps one child, and they had triplets, believe it or not. And they're all great kids, and they're all in college now, because he's 75, they're in their second year of college. They all celebrate the same birthday. They were all bar mitzvahed and bat mitzvahed together, in the same ceremony kind of. So that's Bob Gersony now. And his wife, Cindy, by the way, was a humanitarian aid worker throughout most of her career. And she figures as a character in some of the chapters, like Bosnia and in Rwanda, where she accompanies him. Bob and I are great friends. But I didn't decide to do this book until about 4 years ago, because I knew about Bob's traveling and his interviewing of refugees and all of that, and how the journalists in a war zone would interview dozens, and he would disappear and come back weeks later having interviewed hundreds. I knew he was very special and unique, but I didn't put it all together. Some things but you don't know that essentially. And it was one night 4 years ago, a mutual friend of ours had died, a fellow by the name of Jerry Weaver, who's a minor character in the book, by the way. And Jerry Weaver had passed away, and Bob and I decided to have dinner together at the Cosmos Club in Washington, as it happened. And I asked Bob, just for curiosity, where he went to school, because all along I thought he had gone to Yale or Harvard or someplace like that, because he's polished, spent his life working for state and USAID. And he said, well, actually, I didn't go to college. And then it all came out that he dropped out of high school. I didn't know that he had been to Vietnam. And then it kind of hit me that this is a real story. This is a very unusual character, but I still didn't jump on it. I waited about 4 months and was mulling it over and figured, good book ideas aren't handed to you on a silver platter. You have to tease them out. And it was only after I started on the book and I started interviewing dozens upon dozens of people at USAID, state, elsewhere, and how each of them told me how extraordinary and reliable with information Bob was. It was then that I decided to really pour myself into this book.
Well, great. It was a wonderful investment. We genuinely appreciate it. It's a great story, and among its many virtues too is telling the story of, as you put it so eloquently, somebody who labored sort of in obscurity, unknown, and still to this day is not seeking to be known or to be even an influencer, to use the current jargon. But I think that it does a wonderful job of explaining so much history, so much geography. It's just a great story, and thank you for it. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Joel, and for the Carnegie Ethics Council for hosting me.
Great. Thank you all for joining us.